In a culture where the bulk of people in that culture do not believe in God and do not follow Jesus, how do you live? I mean, obviously, you follow God, hopefully, and you try to do what Jesus said to do, because hopefully that's your orientation. But do you live there differently than if there was the bulk of people around you did the same thing as you? Bulk of people around you were believers and disciples. How do you live? How do you live when, as a believer, you become the minority culture? Is it possible to do that, and do you live differently? And I want you to think about, in terms of, where do you draw the line between right and wrong? Hopefully you have one somewhere. You have a line between right and wrong. Hopefully you don't go crossing it very often. I know sometimes we go against our principles. Sometimes. But when you live in a minority culture among people who don't follow God and probably have a line, that line is in a different place for them, how do you live? Our main text is not in 1 Peter this week. In fact, it may seem like it's a world away from 1 Peter, certainly a few years. But as we've seen, 1 Peter has a bearing on a lot of other situations, on our situations. And the people that Peter was writing to, and where he was writing from, Peter was writing to people that he described as living in exile, living as a minority culture, meaning they found themselves in an unbelieving culture and in a wicked culture. And Peter even describes himself as being in Babylon, which we are pretty sure is code for the city of Rome at that time. And the text we're going to use has great resemblance to that situation. You might say Peter was thinking about this situation when he wrote his text, but we're going to go to Daniel in the Old Testament, the book of Daniel, chapter 1. I don't think we've ever been in the book of Daniel in this, so this is kind of exciting. We don't often venture into the Old Testament, although it has a lot to teach us, but we're going there today. Daniel's after Ezekiel. Let me see. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel. There it is. Find Daniel and then find the first chapter. And while you're finding that, let me just say, the first chapter denotes a tumultuous time for the Israelites in the Old Testament. And we're going to try to get as much of the context as we can by reading the bulk of the first chapter. Not long, so stay with me. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. But first, just for context, understand that the kingdom of Israel was broken into two parts. There was a northern kingdom of 10 tribes, which was called Israel. There was a southern kingdom called Judah, which was 2 tribes. The northern kingdom of Israel, they'd already been taken over by Babylon, by the Assyrians, whose Babylon was their capital city. The southern kingdom of Judah is still held out a little longer, mostly because they had some kings that did the right thing, that weren't wicked, like the typical king in the northern kingdom of Israel. 10 tribes in the north, capital was Samaria. 2 tribes in the south, capital was Jerusalem. All right, the northern part of the kingdom of Israel already gone into captivity. And we pick up in verse 1 of Daniel chapter 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, we don't have a concept of what that's like, but it was ugly. Just know that a lot of suffering took place in the defeat of Judah. It was hard. It was very ugly on those that were there. You could read more about it if you wanted to in 2 Kings chapter 25. And Jehoiakim is not a good guy. And he's leading Judah, and Judah is getting taken over, and it's bad. All right, verse 2. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, his being Nebuchadnezzar, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Notice what? The Lord delivered Jehoiakim. God has a hand in this. God delivered Jehoiakim into the hand of the enemy. This was punishment for all the evil that the king had done and the whole kingdom had done. God brought this on. And in carrying off the articles of the temple, that was to them like walking in and taking the crown jewels of Europe and walking out with your thumb in the ear. Something that they could hardly contemplate. It was evidence of just how far God had let them fall. Okay, verse 3. Then the king, that is the king of Babylon, ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of Babylon. He was to teach all that to them. Notice after defeating the Israelites, what they do. They took the best and the brightest. That's not surprising. That was fairly common. And they brought them back to their city. Now, they brought them ostensibly as slaves, but they were treated well because they were going to be put into the king's service. What they do with them? They taught them the language and the literature of Babylon. Changed their language, changed their stories. All based upon the gods and the culture of a pagan society. Teach all that to them. Have them recite it, have them know it. Why? Because the Babylonians lived with this as their background. This is their backstory, and this is significant. You see, stories affect the heart, and they bring about different beliefs of the heart, and they open up the heart to different beliefs. What this amounts to is assimilation and indoctrination. Read verse 5. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years. And after that, they were to enter into the king's service. 3 years. That's a long time for indoctrination and assimilation. So it was significant and it was lengthy. Verse 6. Among the chosen were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, lest you think I don't know who those guys. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. Okay, why'd they change their names? What's going on there? Their names were Hebrew-based and based upon God. If you're Hebrew and your name ended in El, like Daniel, all right, that was short for Elohim, which is another name for God in Hebrew. So they changed their name. Their names were changed to names based not upon the Hebrew gods, but upon Babylonian gods. It was kind of like, if you take on our names, you proclaim our gods. We don't want you proclaiming the name of the Hebrew God, Yahweh or Elohim. But notice what? Daniel never really takes on this new name. The other guys, not so much, which is interesting. Verse 8. Verse 8 is our key verse today. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now, the idea that Daniel resolved not to do this speaks of something. It speaks of a decision that was made ahead of time. He made a commitment. He made a resolution ahead of time to not defile himself with food off of the king's table. Now, he asked permission to do it, so he's not being a jerk about it. But it was a decision made ahead of time. It means it had forethought. It had commitment. He drew a line between right and wrong for himself, and he did it early on in time. He didn't wait until the situation was upon him and go, oh, wait a minute, I can't eat this. No, he did it ahead of time. See, if you wait until you're in a situation, you may not have the resolve you need. Daniel drew the line early in time before he had to deal with the situation. That might be something we can learn from. Before I start down that slope, I may need to be resolved not to go in that direction. Okay? Now, this was a brave thing to do. Why was it brave? Well, it involved risk because he's not just, they weren't tolerant, all right? They were saying you fit in, and he's a minority culture. It involved risk to go against the culture of the majority. It involved fortitude. It involved commitment to go against the predominating culture. We can learn from that. To be countercultural involves a risk and fortitude and commitment. In a culture where we might be the minority, we might have to display more courage, and we might have to be willing to take a little bit more risk to be countercultural than we did before. In a situation where we're not the majority, we may have to be countercultural and go against the predominating trends, which may take more courage, involve more risk. Okay, verse 9. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. Notice God's already there. God already has his hand in this. He causes the official to be well disposed toward Daniel and the others. You see, God can work with even unbelievers. God can work with anybody and help them be ones who help us. See, help can come from unexpected places, in unexpected ways, from unexpected people. People maybe who don't believe. Notice that Daniel doesn't press that help by being a jerk about it. And that goes back to some of the stuff that we talked about in Peter, where he talked about living among pagans and living good lives. He told about that in 1 Peter chapters 3 and 4. He says, live such good lives among the pagans. Good lives. Be good in here. Don't be proud. Don't be bigoted. Don't be antagonistic. Be good and live good among those who may not do that. And believe that God goes before you and will honor that good living, even among unbelievers. Verse 10. But the official told Daniel, man, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Notice that people of a different culture will not understand believing culture, nor will they believe in it, because they're coming from outside of it. They don't know how God commands us things for our good, and they don't know how God commands us things to bless us, right? They won't understand the character of God like we do, certainly, and they will not understand why we want to follow God. Why would you want to do this? Be understanding of this, being unaware of the culture of God, and work with them. All right, realize they're coming from outside that culture. They're not going to understand our culture of God and the culture of following God. Verse 11. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So in other words, what? Daniel knows if you test what God has commanded you, you'll realize how much of a blessing it can be to you. All right? So he agreed to do this, tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. Oh, how'd you like to have broccoli given to you instead of it? But anyway, now, if you know the Old Testament food laws, and I don't expect you to know them, but you would know that the Old Testament food laws were not water and vegetables. Meat was okay of certain types, like sheep and goat, cattle, not pigs. Wine was okay. I mean, they had issues with water purity and refrigeration issues, so the grape juice had to be fermented in order for it to keep. So some meat was okay and wine was okay. Where did this water and vegetables business come from? This is over the top. Water and vegetables, way more strict than Old Testament food laws. Where is Daniel coming from? In order to be certain to not eat the wrong meats or get them slipped in accidentally, in order to be sure not to drink excess wine if you drank every time the king did, in order to be certain they were doing the right thing so that it would not defile them, they drew the line early and they drew the line tight. I want you to see that. The line between right and wrong for them in the particular area of food. To be countercultural, they drew the line early and they drew the line tight. In order to be countercultural. Now, that doesn't say what their motives were for being so over the top, but we know it had to do with this resolve to not defile themselves. Okay, just as a thought exercise, imagine that they had said, okay, we can do meat, vegetables, and water. And they got some meat, and they didn't know, is this meat okay meat or not okay meat, right? Because once it's cooked, can you tell what kind of meat it is and where it's been? Maybe not. So this way, they're sure they're not defiling themselves. Plus, they were asking a favor from the guard, and rather than give the guard and the authorities over them a whole bunch of guidelines like, well, this meat's okay, this meat's not. No, they just drew the line early. Vegetables and water, make it easy. They drew the line early in a way that they could keep it and be assured of not going over the line in their hearts of right and wrong. To be countercultural, they drew the line early and they drew the line tight. Okay, for us to be countercultural in our day, what might we have to do? We might have to draw the line earlier than we have in the past. And please, think outside of the box of just food and drink. Think about all the kinds of stuff that we do that is in line with the culture around us. And culture is moving in a direction where what is seen as not okay in the past is now seen as okay, and that's going to be even more so in the future. Where, if we want to be countercultural in our day, where might we have to draw the line earlier and tighter? Maybe a place that we could start to look, that we might want to look, is where are we identical to the culture? Where are we doing the same things that non-believers are doing? Where do we not stand out at all? Is it in our money spending? Is it in our consumption of more than just food? Do we spend just as much money on material possessions or trips or anything? Do we seek the same kinds of things for our pleasure? I mean, where are we identical to the culture? And where are we so close to the culture that for all intents and purposes, you can't tell us apart? See, this part of the message is hard because whatever I say, I'm probably stepping on somebody's toes. And if I just leave it on the topic of food, I'm stepping on toes, but then I'm not exploring all the other possibilities, the other possible avenues that we probably need to look at. And if I go down other paths, I might expose myself. I might expose you. So where are we identical to the culture or really similar? That's one place to look. Maybe worry is a good place to look. And I mean, what do we worry about or have fear about? Because that's often a clue as to what do we seek the most. Where do I have anxiety and not peace? Where is Jesus not involved in helping me dial back from the culture? What is it? I mean, what's it for you? Where do we fit into the culture too much? And where do our fears expose that we're seeking something outside of God? And I'm asking this not to get us to judge each other. I'm asking this to get us to judge ourselves. Where could we draw the line tighter? Because a day is coming, I really believe, where we might have to stand out, way out from the culture. There may be a day when we act in a purposeful, countercultural way just to set ourselves apart. Where's that? You know, and I think about in the past, we've made fun of some cultures that were extra conservative. Maybe the Puritans or the Amish. We thought they drew the line way too early. Maybe we were unfair to criticize them. Again, I don't want to produce a guilt trip for you. I want you to be able to live in a way that honors God in a clear fashion to the people around you. And I think about what might that be. But then the other thing I would suggest for you to look at is, what do I want to do? Because if a lot of times what we do and where the line between right and wrong is not where do we want it to be, but where does society put it for us? And if society removes their restrictions from us, and that line is free to move around, okay, now it becomes down to, what do I want to do? Maybe that line is moving now. What do you want to do? Because if we think about what is our love for God pointing us towards, and if we let that really drive us and really lead us to a point, what might we want to do then? If we put on our love for God and just let it run wild to a conclusion, what might that conclusion be? Something unexpected? What, if we did it, or if we didn't do it, what would really please him? And I guess I'm asking, if we think in terms of pleasing God rather than where does society put that line between right and wrong, where might we draw that line differently? Okay, so what? A lot of the time, I'm honestly kind of scared to go to the end point of a line that just lets love for God lead the way, thinking God's going to take me way over there. What if I wasn't afraid of that? Because am I really giving up something so tremendous? And what if a non-believer could see the goodness of God in that there? I guess I'm asking the question, do I trust God for what he tells me where that line should be and what my behavior should look like? See, in the midst of an evil culture, the culture where you live will try to assimilate you, and one of the ways it will try to assimilate you is to help you decide where to put that line because of where it wants it. And where could you draw the line so it's absolutely clear you stand out from the culture? You're not part of it. And where can you resolve ahead of time to stand out and be that candle in the dark? Jesus calls you. He chooses you to follow him. As you follow him, you're going to stand out as much as he did, maybe more. Where does he call you to draw that line earlier and tighter? Where does he want you to live differently? See, as you live in a culture that is getting farther and farther away from Jesus, how can you come back closer to him? And in doing so, maybe separate yourself from the culture and be that candle in the darkness. You want to follow Jesus? You can make a commitment to follow Jesus, and you can do it right here, right now. That's what he's calling you to, but understand what it involves. Let me pray for us. Oh, Father, sometimes we don't trust your heart when you tell us what to do. And we see restrictions rather than love, and rather than a healthy place to have a line and to resolve to do what you said to do, to not defile ourselves. Show us what that might be, and maybe where we could get closer to you out of love for you. Grow our hearts, transform them to be things that just lean into you, even with these things that we do that we look at as being right and wrong. Maybe we can look at them as loving of you or not loving you, and see them differently. Show us how. I pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.